All right. Thanks for coming out, all. I would definitely encourage people to take a look at the Dev Edmonton Slack if you're not a part of it. There's always great discussions happening there, not just in the JavaScript space, but if you're at all full stack, it's always good to hear about even what other frameworks you're using. If you want to go into Python or if you want to do some .NET or you really want to get into some like SQL Server stuff, there's always interesting discussions happening on Dev Edmonton, so I'd encourage you all to check that out. All right, so just as a rough outline of my talk, I meant this to be an introductory series because hopefully we're going to build something along the way in a series of talks, starting out with kind of picking your flavor of React Native because it's become more and more an important consideration as to what direction you're going, because as it becomes more and more popular, it's starting to fragment a bit in ways that I think can really affect especially the long-term health of a product you're going to build in it. The main two choices you have when talking about React Native are mostly whether or not you're going to support either Expo or a pure React Native CLI project. So we'll kind of go over what makes each one special. I have a really interesting kind of demo on Expo because I worry that I speak a little bit too badly of Expo in this presentation. So if you want a little bit of an Easter egg, you can install the Expo client on your mobile device from the Google Play or iOS App Store, and you'll actually be able to get an application from the internet to your device in a couple seconds. And it's a pretty cool little demo, so if you want to do that, look for that near the end of the presentation. And then finally, we'll just kind of go over what's the best choices based on kind of your business requirement. I really think that React Native is the future of mobile development, coming from both kind of the website and the mobile side. I've done all flavors of hybrid development, from something in the progressive web app space all the way into pure native and everything in between, from Xamarin to the various flavors of Swift and Objective-C and Kotlin and Java and all that stuff. I really think that React Native is the way to go, though. And lastly, there is always a photo of me in a wizard costume in all of my presentations, so keep an eye out for that. So first of all, I am Ian Phillipchuk, as you probably have gathered. I am a team lead at Punchcard Systems. We do IT consulting and web and app development, typically in either the custom web app space or in the mobile app space, but we also do document portals and all sorts of just like IT consulting. So enough about me. What exactly is React Native? Well, it's a JavaScript framework for building native applications on both iOS and Android. And it's kind of a true, mostly write once, deploy anywhere approach. When you have a hybrid app, what you're basically doing is you're recreating native-like controls, things like momentum, things like list views in essentially a website. So that's kind of the Cordova approach, and there's various different frameworks you can use in that kind of hybrid space. React Native actually displays your data in native controls, so it's much snappier, while still giving you kind of the template language you expect from JavaScript, from React.js rather. So it's really powerful in that it's really easy to lay something out. The whole world of views and view controllers and scroll views can get quite complicated. There's a lot of power in native, but it ultimately lacks the flexibility. You'll find yourself just wondering why you can't round off something, and you have to look for strange constraints and considerations, whereas in React Native, they've simplified all of that and given you as close to CSS as you actually can. So you write your UI code once, and you truly have a unified kind of display language across both devices. Now that can be complicated because iOS people tend to like their apps to look Apple way, and Android people tend to like them to look the Android or bad way. So you usually have to define some sort of a middle ground, but there's also ways that React Native allows you to bring in native controls so that everyone can get the experience they're expecting on on their own individual platform. So you don't have an Android user flicking at a picker control going, why is this an infinite Rolodex of every year from 1901 to 2020? So you will give people kind of the experience they're expecting. And more than that, there's also the possibility of leveraging a lot of your backend code. In our stack at Punchcard, we use the similar type files, because we're a TypeScript shop, across both mobile and web projects, which allows us to make the data kind of really flow from our backend to whatever front end we're serving to the client. That can be really powerful, and using similar libraries like Axios to access your data in a similar way. There's also a great deal of portability, especially if you are mainly kind of a web shop. And it gives you, like I said, a more powerful templating language. Also, if you've ever worked in native, you know that there's a lot of recompilation that happens. And this can get really annoying for the design-oriented folk who just want to see what it looks like if it was slightly more red. Especially if you work with a client and someone's told you it needs to be crunchier or it needs to pop more, and you have to sit there and like wait for your app to recompile. React Native actually allows you to live reload your application, and Expo kind of takes that and supercharges that experience. And you can also bolt on React Native to existing native code. And there's a lot that's actually built in React Native these days. One of the reasons why it's really kind of ascendant is that there's a lot of people who are taking it on and using it more and more. You'll see a lot of people that will come out with an article saying that React Native is the new future, but confusingly, you also see people who will be like, we've moved away from React Native. And that tends to be that people have an already existing mobile shop where they're trying to kind of bolt on React Native onto it. And so you can do that. So for example, Facebook and Instagram, a lot of those applications are built in React Native because it allows them to quickly and easily iterate and to share UI across platforms. But there is still some considerations of React Native that kind of force you into that native space. And Skype and the Windows Calendar app actually on Windows 10 are built in React Native. So not only can you build React Native applications and deploy them to an app store, you can put them right on a physical device as well. As well as Uber Eats and Uber and Tesla and Discord and the Baidu mobile app, which I hadn't heard of, but Google tells me is used by 600 million people, which is a lot, so it scales. So that's good too. But there's also, like, why shouldn't you use... good, that GIF worked. It didn't work in my last presentation. There's also some considerations about why you shouldn't use React Native. I'm not going to stand up here and claim to you that I wasn't fighting with React Native this afternoon to get something I thought should work working. The biggest change you'll see is that it, while putting a layer of niceness on top of everything, it does kind of isolate you from device fundamentals sometimes. You don't have access to some of the lower level APIs you'd be expecting, and you're kind of a little bit at the mercy of the plugin environment. So you can quickly and easily put a plugin in and start streaming from a camera on a mobile device. But if you want to start doing more complicated things with those devices, you're up to what people have built. There's always the opportunity for you to build your own modules, but that's just kind of adding additional work on and taking a little bit of the shine away. You're also limited, for now, for the bridge between the JavaScript code and the native code on both devices, which means that there is kind of a throughput to the really high-intensity tasks you can do. There's a new feature called Turbo Modules coming, which is going to expose kind of a C++ layer, which should run a lot faster and allow you to access a lot more device fundamentals. So you're going to have a big speed increase in the next kind of 6 months as people begin to adopt that architecture. And unfortunately, the most commonly used design paradigm on both iOS and Android is the infinite scroll. And that is one area where a lot of specific tooling has gone in on the native side to make sure it's really snappy. If you've ever looked at kind of the memory model of a UI table view, it's really fascinating how they're reusing the same spaces to give you items even though you're flipping through thousands of them. Really, you're only seeing about 5 actual items. They're just changing the data being displayed on them. So it's really clever, and React Native unfortunately can't quite replicate that. They have infinite list controls, but when you have an Instagram style and you want to look through 5,000 different people's posts, that tends to be built in native and then has the React Native stuff built on top of it. And just kind of as a graph from between native development to web development, on the native side you have speed and access to device hardware, and on the web side you have generally lots of developers and powerful styling and platform independence kind of somewhere in the middle. And luckily that middle spot is right where React Native hits. So in general, focus on native if you want advanced graphics, like if you have to touch Metal at all or OpenGL. Just don't do that through React Native. Trust me, that was my afternoon. It's bad. If you need access to a lot of the device fundamentals, like really specific accelerometer controls, that sort of stuff tends to be better on native, although you can still access all of that through React Native. And anything that's processor intensive or where you're going to be limited by the throughput of the JavaScript bridge. You want to focus on React Native, though, if your app is a lot more presentationally focused, because it really does have that powerful presentational layer that sits on top of the native layer. And if you have React.js resources especially, it is not all that much more complicated to transition to React Native. It's certainly a lot easier to go from that to mobile. because while it does have a CSS-like syntax, it's not truly cascading and it's not truly CSS. It's kind of an implementation of it. As well, you can't just use divs. You have to use actually views. So there's some native kind of comparisons for the primitive kind of JavaScript elements. And if you're already doing React.js, it's really easy to start. We have a few people who have never done web program or mobile programming in their life, and they're laying out views pretty quickly and working with all of the kind of fiddly bits of React, talking about forms and all that stuff. It works as you'd expect. Your kind of controller code works the same. So I mentioned that there was kind of two fundamental flavors, Expo and native CLI. I'm going to talk first about Expo, which is a system where rather than building entirely native views, you're instead kind of halfway doing a hybrid approach where you're putting more burden presentationally on the JavaScript layer. But that does mean that you can actually ship a full-featured UI to someone through a QR code, which is pretty darn cool, because essentially what you're doing is you're making a connection to a remote bundler. React Native works by in the development environment by bundling your JavaScript resources together and then giving it to the UI to display. And Expo takes that bundler and puts it in the cloud, and that just means you can do some really cool things. You'll see later that I'll have an app and I'll put it on people's phones, and then I'll change it on your phones right while you're watching it. And that's really good, especially if you have an environment that's really, really presentationally focused. So if we're talking about an app for a conference, like, say, Polyglot, which you should all attend because it's really good, where you just want to display a list of speakers, but you want images, you want colors, you have a bunch of brands being like, that's not my particular flavor of orange. The ability of Expo to really iterate quickly is kind of unraveled. And it also has, it bundles together a series of high-quality plugins to access pretty common device tasks like camera and file system acceleration. And you can also, because it's almost entirely JavaScript, you can actually push updates to your application over the air. So if you have released some horrifying bug, let's say you've made a caucus counting application and you maybe have some security holes, you're able to push updates directly to people's devices quickly and easily without having to worry about the App Store. If you've never had an app approved by Apple, I have on many occasions had them disagree with our decisions, and I've been able to get around it by quoting their regulations, which I have followed to the letter back to them, and then they just kind of stop. So it's a process that you just don't have to, you can avoid if you don't have to. There are some negatives to Expo, though, obviously. It's not just perfect, or else everyone would be using it. It's really good when your app requirements are supported by their ecosystem, but even more so than React Native. If you have to move away from what they do really well, which is presentation, iteration, and those kind of key device tasks, it really begins to fall flat. The process of actually delivering your app to someone is also somewhat complicated. You can deliver it fairly seamlessly through the Expo client, but if you're going to package it, you're left with kind of two options. Have a giant bloated application that has all of Expo surrounding all of your code, and just which inflates your package size and kind of makes things complicated, or you're left kind of ejecting your application and suffering a whole host of issues. There's a whole bunch of packages that try and take the Expo features and deliver them to the kind of the CLI, the base React Native world, but I've never ejected a application from Expo and had it just be like, great, now you can work. It's always solve these 15 problems before you can do anything. And it's also just another complicated item on an already complicated tool chain to break. React Native does suffer a little bit from the fact that you're building so many things on top of native code. So if something goes wrong, it can be like yak shaving, really, to find a solution to your problem. And if you're going to add another layer on top of that, it's just another thing to debug. If your solution is working perfect and all you're doing is you're adding text and you're adding views, or adding different types of controllers and screens, everything works perfectly, but typically when you start to do something really clever, it tends to break down. So React Native CLI, on the other hand, has a lot of the similar positives. Because you still have that live reload feature, when working in a limited scale with a designer or with a stakeholder, you still can tweak things on the fly and have stuff iterate very quickly, which is amazing if you've never had it before. And the ecosystem is more varied than Expo. Expo tends to have a few very high-quality plugins, whereas React Native tends to have a wide variety of them that are just as well implemented, but also you can get access to things that are a little bit more flexible. And because you're already working with native in a little bit closer of a relationship, it's a lot easier for you to write your own custom module if you need to get access to something crazy. If you really needed to expose some form of hardware graphics to the user, that's easier to do on something like React Native than it is on Expo. And also, it's compared to Expo, it's a much more seamless build and packaging experience because you're still using Android Studio and Xcode to build and package and deliver it, except if you're on App Center, which is a plug for those people who use Microsoft, which has a great pipeline that supports React Native. So that's always an option as well. So thinking about kind of those two flavors of Expo versus CLI, you really want to focus on Expo if you're really looking for really quick iterating capabilities. It's really good for a prototyping phase, or something where you're working with trying to develop an idea. So if you have an idea you just want to see on an application, within seconds you can put a picture of your cat up on everyone's phone in a 10-mile radius. That's really easy to do. If you're working with someone who's trying to prototype out an idea, it's a great prototyping tool. When you actually come to actually implementing it, again, it kind of falls flat. If it's really kind of a CRUD-style application, something that's going to present and consume data, that's something that's ideal for Expo. Because then you can leverage the inherent benefits of React Native, which is that universal styling, that write once, deploy everywhere kind of idea. And if you need to support over-the-air updates, Microsoft has code push for React Native, but it's not as really powerful as the Expo code push is. You can change fundamentally how your Expo application works in seconds. It's a lot more complicated and a lot more restrictive to push over-the-air updates to a mobile device because both iOS and Apple don't like you changing what's called executable code. Thankfully, and a little bit insultingly for us, they don't consider JavaScript executable. So you can change all that stuff, but there are some fundamentals that you can't. You can't, for example, include a new package or something, but you can push changes and updates to some of your resources. And Expo is also really good if you have just something simple that probably won't scale. Because as things scale, the increased technical complexity is going to push you towards React Native. And the worst spot you can be in is in an Expo project and being forced to eject and then transition to a React Native project because you'll be rediscovering your tooling and trying to get everything to work again in almost a brand new environment. Conversely, you should choose React Native CLI if you need access to native modules of any kind. I know I said that they had really great camera and acceleration and Bluetooth and all of those controls. If you have to use them in a way that is essential to your application, I think it's just better to go with the CLI route. This didn't used to be the case, but those packages, the React Native community has really stepped up. They've taken over ownership of several key, formerly core React Native packages, things like async storage, and they've really kind of iterated on them and brought them close to or exceeding the level of Expo in some cases. If you want to use anything that's not like a kind of a core package as well, just use CLI, or if you're familiar with Xcode or Android Studio, or if you have any need of complicated mobile techniques like background services, you should really use the CLI at that point. So kind of the TLDR is that the more CRUD your app is, the more you should choose Expo. The less CRUD your app is, the more you should choose React CLI. But just always choose TypeScript, because TypeScript is better. And everyone will love you except for your designers, who may burn down your desk. But you just need to explain to them that it'll make everyone's lives better. And then eventually the mind control will kind of take over, and they'll accept that what you've said is law. So that's kind of the introduction. I'm hoping to, in the next couple of spaces, as time permits, start building an application kind of with React Native kind of in front of you. So hopefully we can transition this from an introductory course into more of a programming one. And I absolutely promise you a photo of me in a wizard costume. If you haven't LARPed, you haven't lived. So I have a 10-part presentation that sadly has not passed approval yet about why LARP is amazing. So I guess I'll open up the floor to any questions.
When you say scale, like, what do you mean exactly scale to? It's one device.
I mean scale more in the business sense. So if you're building an application that is simple and you have a very defined business requirement and you can kind of put your arms around what the solution is going to be, then I'm more likely to recommend Expo in that case, because then you can tick off all your boxes and really identify that Expo is a solution that's going to work for you. Sorry, the question was why did you mention scaling, basically? Like, what's the definition of that? when you are building a product, especially something where you imagine this is going to be the linchpin of your business, that's going to evolve in complexity, and then that means that eventually you're going to be putting in more and more third-party plugins, and the more you do that, the more I really get nervous that at some point you're going to have some fundamental breakdown in your tooling and really have to shift to CLI anyways, and so it's better to just accept that burden from the beginning, in my opinion.
What's the big difference between the live hot reloading from CLI versus Expo?
The question was, what's the difference between the live hot reloading from CLI versus Expo? The difference is that for CLI, it's a harder connection to make. Typically, you do it over a wire. You can configure it to work over Wi-Fi. I think that's actually a great question to look into Snacks. So anyone who has opened up the Expo app on your phone, why don't I deploy an Expo app to your phone, and then I can show you how cool it is. We're mirroring, right? Okay, cool. So I have here an app, which you notice is called Spunky Beef Jerky, which they give you a different name that's food-related, and they're typically disgusting. But if we just open up this thing, if you take your client here, like if I open up my client and just take a photo of it or put it up in your camera, and it should bring up the open in, we'll do it over here, open in Expo option, then this application actually is delivered right to my phone. You can see that it should say on it, change code in the editor and watch it change on your phone. Saved, you get a shareable URL. So I can put in here, hi, Exchange.js, and then just wait for a second. And if you've brought it up, you'll see that it is actually already changed on your device. But what if I want to use some form of a more complicated thing? I did this a while ago and it blew people's minds. Like, let's say I have this package. Oh no, I can't find that. Let me just import an NPM package and get it to reload and work. There you go, NPM package, done. So that's kind of the power that I'm talking about when it comes to like iteration. This is obviously like they're called snacks for a reason because they're designed to be like small. This is something where you might have a front-end engineer looking and working with you to really nail what like a card looks like in a really presentationally focused application. But that's the kind of power you can get from Expo, and like without doing any work or having you all install anything, having to worry about provisioning profiles or any of that stuff on iOS or getting a build onto someone's device, I was able to deliver an application to people's phones and update it. So that's kind of the power of Expo, and like it's the selling feature by far. But it's also kind of the curse that you're locked into this ecosystem that makes all that possible. We'll go with the question in the back first before we do follow-up.
So in your experience with React Native, has there been any situations that you actually need to write native code to get something working?
For us, there really hasn't been specific ones. We've built an application that does have an infinite scroll, but because of the nature of what we're scrolling past, because it's more shopping oriented, people were considering the items, so we didn't actually have to come across that infinite scroll problem that a lot of people do. But in our space, because we do consulting, a lot of the people that have really sort of processor intensive or really graphically intensive applications tend to have IT teams already, so they don't always come to us. So we found that it's worked really well for kind of our niche, but we still have applications that access a lot of the device fundamentals, especially camera. Camera is really hard to avoid. So we haven't had a necessary thing for it professionally, but I can see it happening. There's another question here if there's no one else.
So this might seem a little bit off topic, but do you have any experience using React Native on the web? And if so, what are the major challenges you run into?
I mean,
because I'm guessing that's how the Windows 10 apps work, right?
I think those are Electron, I'm pretty sure. So there are ways to ship web apps to people in like a desktop type environment, kind of similar to that hybrid style where what you're doing is you're essentially running a website within an application. You're running a quick like kind of like web layer on top of it so you can display that stuff. I would honestly say that while I'm a huge believer in React Native, React, like the full-bodied version of it, is just better for the web. I wouldn't attempt that. I know that Snacks, for example, do run on web, but that's, I believe they're making a back-end connection to a virtual machine at that point. So I would just recommend you go towards React at that point.
Another question. So in case you're using a web application and a mobile application, and you're using React and React Native, have you had any situation that you share code between the two? I noticed that you mentioned that, for example, you share types, but for example, in terms of business logic.
Well, there's always the risk that when you're delivering a mobile application to someone, your code is hosted somewhere, right? Like that's one of the reasons why authentication is harder on mobile, because the device that you're working with isn't as secured as a website that lives on a server that you control. So we tend to put our business at the API layer, not at the client layer. But in terms of backend services for doing, we have an app that does Redux, for example. So doing all of our reducers and all of our state management is the same across two of our applications. They're on web and on mobile. As well, a lot of the controller code that back screens can be reused. So we're using the same sort of like state management techniques on both sides. And so the people who are writing fundamentally the code that makes text appear in text boxes and turns things green, that's all the same. But we don't, just due to the nature of what we've been doing lately, have specific examples of like large scale kind of business requirements being done on mobile. Exactly. Yeah.
Got a quick comparison against Flutter.
Facebook versus Google. It's complicated. I think that Flutter has a lot of power behind it because the people who make it make a smartphone operating system. So there's a lot of oomph behind it. I would say that for us, the focus should maybe be on React Native, just because I'm pretty sure all of us have touched React at some point or looked at it. So I think there's just a greater awareness. I wouldn't say that anything is better or worse. I would say that I feel like React Native has the momentum in non-traditional mobile areas. So when web comes into mobile, or when people are coming into mobile from native, but I'd say that maybe React Native has a bit more overall momentum. I don't think you can make a wrong decision there. Obviously, I've kind of picked a horse in this fight. Don't make horses fight. That's bad. But I don't think either one's bad. You can create rich, beautiful UIs across both. Flutter does have an easier integration with Firebase, but React Native does not have a bad integration with Firebase at all. It's just more that like you'll find more documentation because, hey, the people who wrote Firebase wrote Flutter. So I don't really have a great answer for you there. Any last questions? I'm kind of running out of time here, I think. Cool. I'm Ian. I work at PunchCard. If you want to talk to me about anything, just come find me after the fact. Thank you.